Good evening, and welcome to tonight's Monterey Peninsula College Guest Authors Series event featuring Aimme Bender. I'm Henry Marchand. I'm in the English department here, teach creative writing classes. Before we get going, I have a couple of bits of business I have to take care of. First of all, I want to thank the people who helped to make tonight's event possible. These include, most specifically, Michelle Brock and Rosa Arroyo of the Humanities Division office, the Humanities Division itself, the English department, the MPC Foundation, and a generous, much appreciated grant from the Arts Council for Monterey County. Part of my job here as the creative writing guy is to coordinate this guest author series. And in so doing, I get to reach out to my fellow writers across this land of ours to see who might like to come to campus and join us, to meet with writing-inclined students, and to do one of these marvelous public readings and question and answers in the evening. I was thrilled when Aimme Bender said that she would love to come to Monterey and do this. Aimme has been one of my favorite contemporary fiction writers for years. I was hooked by her first collection of short stories, The Girl in the Flammable Skirt, some years ago. After reading that, I have read her two novels, An Invisible Sign of My Own and The Particular Sadness of Lemon Cake. Her second collection of short stories, Willful Creatures. And I'm always happy to see a new Aimme Bender story in a major magazine, which happens gratifyingly often. I'm going to pause here to give another writer a credit because I'm about to read to you, haven't committed this to memory, some comments about Aimme Bender's work made by a local writer, a former MPC student, I'm glad to say, Kevin Smith. I'm going to embarrass him. He's here with us this evening, sitting here. Kevin is the creator and the author of Arts Alive. It's an arts and culture-oriented blog for Monterey County. And he posted a notice about tonight's reading very kindly on his blog. And he posted his own comments about Aimme's fiction. And I want to read you something that I think says what I'd say, maybe a little better. And that kind of ticks me off, Kevin. You shouldn't do these things. Kevin says, Aimme Bender writes with an utterly unique narrative voice that often marries narrative realism with elements of fantasy and the absurd. Yet the surreal detail is never really the point. Yes, a boy is born with keys for fingers, but the story is about finding one's purpose in life and trying to answer the question, what is the greatest mystery of your family? And that's quite a question. And yes, the girl can taste her mother's secret feelings in the food she prepares. But is this really so strange? As children, we absorb into our bodies the stories and feelings our fathers and mothers absorbed from their mothers and fathers. Aimme Bender's surrealist details shine an imaginative light on that which can't be measured, yet may be the truest thing about us. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a true pleasure for me to introduce, here in Monterey from Los Angeles, where she lives and teaches creative writing at USC, Aimme Bender.
I decided to read a newer story, one that came out in an anthology last year, and the assignment for the anthology was to rewrite a fairy tale. And I teach a class on fairy tales, so it was just really fun to think of one, and the one I rewrote is called Donkey Skin, and it's kind of lesser known, and it's by Charles Perrault, and it was probably in 1780-something in France that he published it. And I think all you need to know going in, and that story takes about a half hour, and then I'd love to answer questions and talk about fiction and all of that. I think the main thing you need to know is the setup of that story is that there's a king and a queen. The queen dies from a long illness, and the king is single, and there's several versions of this type of story. Cat skin is another one. There's something where it's, the main character, this doesn't happen in my story, but she ends up wearing some kind of animal disguise, fur, and then showing her beauty at some point. So this is not that story, that's the real story. But so the king gets some advice from someone who says, you know, you should marry the first woman who walks around the corner, or in other versions, they're just very direct and they say, you know, your daughter's real cute, you should marry her. And so that's what he decides to do, which of course is a bit of a problem. So the daughter, the princess, tries to figure out ways to make him not marry her. And the initial way is she asks him and his tailors to make dresses that are kind of extraordinary. This is called the Color Master. Our store was expensive. I mean expensive as anything would be if all its requests were clothing in the color of natural elements. The Duke's son wanted shoes the color of rock so he could walk in the rock and not see his feet. He was vain that way. He did not like to see his feet. He wanted to appear from a distance as a floating pair of ankles. But rock, of course, is many colors. It's subtle, but it's not just one plain gray. That I can promise. And in order to truly blend in, it would not do to give the Duke a regular pair of lovely, pure, gray-dyed shoes. So we had to trek over as a group to his dukedom, a 3-day trip, and take bagfuls of the rocks with us as rocks he would be walking on, and then use those at the studio as guides. I spent 5 hours one afternoon just staring at a rock, trying to see into its color scheme. Gray, my head kept saying. I see gray. At the shop in general, we built clothing and shoes, soles and heels, shirts and coats. We treated the leather, shaped and wove the cloth, and even when an item wasn't ordered as a special request, one order of shoes or one robe might cost as much as a pony or a month's food from the market stalls. Most villagers did not have this kind of money, so the bulk of our customers were royalty or the occasional traveler riding through town who had heard rumors of our skills. For this pair, for the Duke, all of us tailors and shoemakers who numbered about 12 were working round the clock. One man had the idea to grind bits of rock into particles, and then he added those particles to the dye washing bin. This helped a little. We attended visualization seminars where we tried to imagine what it was like to be a rock, and then quietly, after an hour of deep thought and breathing, returned to our desks and tried to insert that imagery into our choices about how long to leave the shoes in the dye bath. We felt the power of the mountain in the rock and let that play a subtle subtextual role. And then once the dye had reached ultimate power and once the shoes were a beautiful pure gray, a rocky gray, but still gray, we summoned the Color Master. She lived about a half-mile away, in a cottage behind the scrubby oak grove. We summoned her by sending off a goat down the lane because she did not like to be disturbed by people, and the goat would trot down the road and butt on the door as her cue. She'd set up our studio and shop in the first place years ago. She does the final work. But the Color Master has been looking unwell these days. For our last project, the Duchess's handbag, which was supposed to look like a just blooming rose, she wore herself out thinking about pink and was in bed for weeks after recovering, which had never happened before. Pink, she kept saying as she tossed around in her bed. Birth, sex, blushes, kisses. She had a very high fever and lost too much weight. Dark circles ringed her eyes. Also, her younger brother suffers from terrible back problems and cannot move or work and lives with her on the sofa all day long. Also, she's growing older and she is certainly the most talented in the kingdom and gets zero recognition. We, the tailors and shoemakers, we know of her gifts, but does the king? Do the townsfolk? She walks among them like an ordinary being shopping for tomatoes, and no one knows that the world she's seeing is about 1,000 times more detailed than the world anyone else is looking at. When you see a tomato, like me, you probably see a very nice red orb with a green stem, smelling fresh and delectable, with a gentle give to the touch. When she sees a tomato, she sees blues and browns and yellows and curves, and the vine it came on, and she can probably even guess how many seeds are in a given tomato based on how heavy it feels in her hand. So we sent over the goat, and when she came into the studio with the goat, we just finished the 4th drying of the rock shoes. They were drying on a mat, and they looked pretty good. I told Cheryl that her visualization of the mountain had definitely helped because it was a deeper, stronger gray than I'd expected. Cheryl blushed. She's one of the nicer ones. I said, too, that Edwin's addition of the rocks to the dye had added a useful kind of rough texture. He kicked a stool leg, pleased. I hadn't done much. I'm not the most skilled, but I like to commend good work when I see it. But the thing is, even with all our hard work, with all our deepening, they still looked like really beautiful gray shoes, the kind any normal person would love if they didn't have this curious vanity about vanishing feet. The Color Master walked in wearing a linen sheath woven with blue threadings, her face hinting at gaunt. She greeted us all by nodding and then stood at the counter where the shoes were drip drying. Very nice work, she said. Esther, who had fronted the dyeing process, curtsied. We sprinkled rocks into the dye, she said. A fine choice, said the color master. Edwin did a little dance in place over at his table. The goat settled on a pillow in the corner and began to eat the stuffing. The color master rolled her shoulders a few times, and when the shoes were dry, she laid her hands upon them. She lifted them up to the sunlight. She picked up a rock next to the shoe and looked at the rock and the light next to the shoe. She circled both inside different light rays. Then she went to the palette area and took out a handful of blue dust. We have about 150 metal bins of this dust in a range of colors. The bins stand side by side, running the perimeter of the studio. They're narrow, so we can fit a whole lot of colors, and if someone brings in a new color, we hammer down a new bin and slide it into the spectrum, wherever it fits. One tailor found an amazing deep burgundy off in the driest part of the forest on a series of leaves. I located once a type of dirt that was a deeper brown than sand, but not like rich mud, over by the reddish iron deposits near the lake. Someone else found a new blue in a dried out pansy flower and another in the feathers of a dead bird. We have instructions to hunt for color everywhere, at all times. The color master toured the room and then took that handful of blue dust, and always when I watch, I'm thrilled. Blue, how does she know blue? It was a darkish blue too, seemingly far too dark for shoes this light unless he wanted wet rock shoes. And she rubbed the dust into the shoe. Back to the bins, and then she got a black, a dusty black, and then some sage green, all rubbed into the gray shoe. While she worked, everyone sat around quiet. We dropped our usual drudgery and chit-chat. The color master worked swiftly, but she added usually something on the level of 40 colors, so the process, even quickly, took more than 2 hours. She added a color here, a color there, sometimes the size of salt particles, and the gray in the shoe shifted and shaded under her hands. She would reach a level and ask for sealant, and Esther would step forward, and the color master would coat the shoe to seal in the colors and then return to the sunlight, holding a shoe up with the rock in her other hand. This went on for about 4 rounds. I swear I could start to feel the original mountain's presence in the room, the great, heavy, lumbering voice of it. When she was done, the pair was so gray, so rock-like, you could hardly believe they were made of leather at all. They looked as if they'd been sheared straight from a craggy mountainside. Done, she said. We circled her, bowing our heads. Beautiful, I said. Another triumph, murmured Sandy next to me, who cannot color mix to save her life. The color master swept her gaze around the room, and her eyes rested on each of us, searching slowly until they finally settled on me. Me? Will you walk me home? She said in a deep voice while Esther tied an invoice to the foot of a pigeon and then threw it out the window in the direction of the dukedom. I would be honored, I said. I took her arm. The goat, full of pillow, tripped along behind us. I am a quiet sort, except for the paying of compliments, and I didn't know if I should ask her anything on the walk. As far as I knew, she didn't usually ask for an escort home at all. Mainly, I just looked at all the stones and rocks on the path, and for the first time saw that blue hint in the blackness and the shades of green, and that faint edge of purple if the light hit just so. She seemed relieved that I wasn't asking questions, so much so that it occurred to me that was probably why she'd asked me to walk her home in the first place. At the door, she fixed her eyes on me, gray, steady, aging at the corners. She was almost twice my age, but had always had a sexiness I'd admired, a way of holding her body that let you know there was a body there, but that it was private, that stuff happened on it, in it, to it, but it was stuff that I would never see. It made me sad seeing that, while also knowing about her husband who'd gone off to the war years ago and had never returned, and how it was difficult for her to have people over because of her brother with the bad back, and how long ago she had fled her town for a reason she never spoke of. Plus she had a thick cough and her own money issues, which seemed so unfair when she should have been living in the palace, as far as I was concerned. Listen, she said. She held me in her gaze. Yes? There's a big request coming in, she said. I've heard rumors. Big, huge. What is it? I don't know yet, she said, but start preparing. You'll have to take over. I'll die soon, she said. Excuse me? Soon, she said. I can feel it brewing. Death. It's not dark, nor is it white. It's almost a blue-purple, she said. Her eyes went past me to the sky. I'll do my best, she said. I'll do a fair bit of prep. But start preparing your color skills, missy. She lowered her brow and her look was stern. My name is Patty, I said. She laughed. How do you know? I said. Do you mean it? Are you ill? No, she said. Yes, I mean it. I'm asking for your help. And when I die, it will be your job to finish. But I'm not very good, I said, like at all. You can't die. You should ask Esther or Hans. You, she said. And with a little curt nod, she went into her house and shut the door. The Duke's son loved his shoes so much he sent us a drawing by the court illustrator of him in them floating, it appeared, on a pile of rocks. I love them, he said in swirly handwriting. I love them, I love them. And then he added a small cash bonus, including horse rides and a feast at the dukedom. We all attended in all our finery, and it was a great time. It was the last time I saw the color master dancing in her pearl gray gown, and I knew it was the last, even as I watched it, her hair swirling out as she glided through the group. The Duke kept tapping his toe on the side, holding the Duchess's hand, her free one grasping a handbag, the perfect pink of a rose, so vivid and fresh it seemed to carry over a sweet scent, even across the ballroom. 2 weeks later, almost everyone was away when the king's courtier came riding over with the request, a dress the color of the moon. The color master was not feeling well and had asked not to be disturbed. Esther's father was ill, so she was off taking care of him. Hans's wife was giving birth to twins, so he was off with her. The 2 others ahead of me had caught whooping cough, and someone else was on a travel trip to find a new shade of orange. So the request, written on a scroll, went to me, the apprentice, just as the color master had hoped. I unrolled the scroll and read it quietly by the window. A dress the color of the moon. It was impossible. First of all, the moon is not a color. It is a reflection of a color. Second, it is not even the reflection of a color. It's the reflection of what appears to be a color, but is really, in fact, a bunch of bursting hydrogen atoms far, far away. Third, the moon shines. A dress cannot shine like the moon unless the dress is also reflecting something, and our reflective materials are generally tacky looking or too industrial. Our only options were silk and cotton and leather. The moon, it is white, it is silver white, it is not an easy color to dye. A dress the color of the moon, the whole thing made me irritable. But this was not a small order. This was, after all, the king's daughter, the princess. And since the queen had died a few months before of pneumonia, this was now a dress for the most important woman in the kingdom. I paced several times around the studio, and I went against policy and tried knocking on the door of the color master's cabin, but she called out in a strong voice from a window, "Just do it." "Are you okay?" I asked, and she said, "Come back once you've started." I walked back, kicking twigs and acorns. I ate a few oranges off the tree out back until I felt a little better. Since I was in charge due to the pecking order issue, I gathered together everyone who was left in the studio and asked for a seminar on reflection, to reflect upon reflection. In particular for Cheryl, who really used the seminars well. Those of us who were there gathered in a circle in the side room, and we talked about mirrors and still water and wells and feeling understood and opals, and then we did a creative writing exercise about our first memory of the moon and how it affected us in the moment when we realized it followed us. Sandy had a charming story about going on a walk as a child and trying to lose it, but not being able to. And then we wrote haiku. Mine was this: "Moon, you silver thing, floating in the sky like that, make me a dress, please." After a few tears of Edwin's story of realizing his father in the army was seeing the same moon he saw from home, we drifted out of the seminar room and began dyeing the silk. It had to be silk, of course, and we selected a very, very fine weave, a really elegant one from the loom studio that had a touch of shimmer in the fabric already. I let Cheryl start the dyeing with shades of white on the silk because I could see a kind of shining light in her eyes from the seminar. She's so receptive that way. When we did our series on bugs, I could practically spot the fighting ants in her pupils. Today, reflective light in the irises and even a luminosity to her skin. While she began that first layer, I went to see the color master again. She was in bed. It was shocking how quickly she was going downhill. No one usually went over there, but I let myself in, got her brother a glass of water and an apple cheese snack. Angel, he called me. And then I settled next to the bed where she lay resting, her hair spread over the pillows in rays of silver. She was not very old, the color master, but she had gone silver early. "Wait, can we use your hair?" I said. "Sure." She didn't seem bothered by my presence and pulled out a few strands, handed them over. "This'll help," I said, looking at the glint, "if we try to make this into particles." "Good," she said, "good thinking." "How are you doing?" I asked. "Moon today, sun soon," she said. I heard word. "What? Sun, soon. How goes moon? It's hard, I said. I mean hard, and with your hair that'll help, but to reflect? Use blue, she said. What kind? Several kinds, she said. Her voice was weaker, but I could hear the steel behind it as she walked through the bins in her mind. The pale blue, but don't be afraid of the darker blue. Never be afraid of the darker colors. I'm a terrible color mixer, I said. Are you in pain? No, she said, just weak. The moon is easier than you think, she said. Blue and then black to provide shading. On the dress, black? A tiny bit, she said. She pulled out a few more strands of hair. Here, she said. And she said, shavings of opal. Do we have those? Too expensive, I said. Go to the mine, she said. There are always shavings there. Get opals, shave them, add them to the mix, a new bin, an opalescent bin. Do you know the king wants to marry his daughter? Her eyes flashed for a second with anger. What? Put that in the dress too, she said. She dropped her voice to a whisper, every word sharp and clear. Anger, she said. Put anger in the dress, the moon as our guide. A daughter should not be ordered to marry her father, she said. Put anger in the dress? When you mix, she said. Got it? When you're putting the opal shavings in, the dress is supposed to be a dowry gift, but give the daughter the strength to leave instead. All right? Her eyes were shining at me so bright I wanted to put them in the dress too. Okay, I said, faltering. I'm not sure. You have it in you, she said. I see it, truly, or I never would have given you the job. And then she fell back on her pillows and was asleep in seconds, exhausted. On the walk back through the scrubby oak grove, I felt as I usually felt, both moved and shitty. Because what she saw in me could just as easily have been the result of some kind of fever. Was she hallucinating? Did she realize I had gotten the job only because I'd complimented Esther on her scarf at the fair? Plus, I always took out the trash on time. Who's to say there was anything to it? To me, really? Anger in the dress? I didn't feel angry, just defeated and bad about myself, but I didn't put that in the dress. It didn't seem fair to anyone. Instead, I went to the mine and befriended the head miner, Manny, who I knew a little from my cousin who'd worked there a while back to make some extra cash. And Manny gave me a handful of opals that were too small for any jewelry and would work well as shavings. I spent the afternoon with the sharpest picks and awls I could find, breaking open opals and making a new bin for the dust. Cheryl had done wonders with the white, and the dress was like a gleaming pearl, almost moonlight, but not enough yet. I added the opals and we re-dyed, and then you could see a hint of rainbow hovering below the surface. Not so moonlight, but still good, like the sun was shimmering in there too, and that was addressing the reflective issue. When it came time to color mix, I felt like I was going to throw up, but I did what she'd asked, and I went for blue and then black, and I was incredibly slow, like incredibly slow. But for one moment, I felt something as I hovered over the bins of blue. I just felt a tug of guidance from the white of the dress, and it led my hand to the middle blue. It felt for a second like harmonizing in a choir, the moment where the voice sinks into the chord structure and the sound becomes larger, more layered and full than it had been before. So that was the right choice. I wasn't so on the mark for the black, which was slightly too light and seemed to make the moon more like the moon when it's just setting, when the light of day has already started to rise and encroach, which isn't the moon they wanted. They wanted black of night moon, of course. But when we held it up in the middle of the room, there it was, moonlight. Not as good as anything the color master had done, maybe 1/100th as good, but there was something in it that would pass the test of the assignment. Like the king and princess wouldn't collapse in awe, but they would be pleased, maybe even a little stirred. Color is nothing unless it next to other colors, the color master told us all the time. Color does not exist alone. And I got it for a second with that blue. I did. Cheryl and I packed the dress carefully in a box and sent off the pigeon with the invoice and waited for the king's courtiers to come by, and they did, with a carriage for the dress only, and we laid it carefully on the velvet back seat, and they gave us a hunk of chocolate as a bonus, which Cheryl and I ate together in the side room, exhausted, relieved. I went home and slept for 20 hours. I had put no anger in the dress. I remember that when I woke up. Who can put anger in a dress when so focused on just making an acceptable moon feeling for the assignment? They didn't ask for anger, I said, showering, eating a few apples for breakfast. They asked for the moon, and I gave them something vaguely moon-like. That afternoon, I went to see the color master to tell her all about it. I left out the absence of the anger, and she didn't ask. I told her I'd messed up on the black, and she laughed and laughed from her bed. She liked hearing it. I told her about the moon being more of a morning moon. I told her what I'd felt at the blue, the feeling of the cord, and she picked up my hand, squeezed it lightly, and smiled at me. Death is glowing, she said. I can see it. I felt a heaviness rustle in my chest. How long, I said. A few weeks, she said. The sun will come in soon. The princess has still not left the castle. But we need you, I said, and with effort she squeezed my hand again. It is dark and glowing, she said, her eyes sliding over to lock onto mine. It is like loam, she said. The sun? Tomorrow, she said. She closed her eyes. At the studio, the absentees were returning slowly from their various tangents, but I'd received such good marks on the moon dress that I was assigned to the king's next order because everyone felt a little jittery about the color master's absence and wanted to go with what and whoever seemed to work. And sure enough, when I got to work the next day, there was an elaborate thank you note from the castle with a lot of praise for the moon dress and this over-the-top fancy calligraphy and a bonus bolt of fuchsia silk and then the new assignment for a dress the color of the sun. Esther told me congratulations. I did a few deep knee bends and got to work. I liked that guy at the mine a little bit, the Manny guy, so I went back to ask about tourmaline for the sun, even though it didn't really fit color-wise, and I knew I wouldn't use any shavings. But we had a nice roast turkey lunch together in the sunspot outside the rocky opening of the cave, and I told him about the dress I was making for the princess. Sun, he said, shaking his head. What color is the sun? Beats me, I said. We're not supposed to look at it, right? All kids make it yellow, I said, but I think that's not quite right. Ivory, he said. Sort of burned white, I said, but with a halo? That's hard work, he said, folding up his sandwich paper. He had a nice face to him, something chunky in his nose that I could get behind. It made him into the kind of guy you'd want to call on in an emergency. Yours too, I said. His hands were rough from pulling at the walls for years. Want to go to the fair sometime, he asked. The outdoor fair happened on weekends in the main square where everything was sold. Sure, I said. Maybe there's some sun stuff there. I'd love to, I said. We began the first round of dyeing at the end of the week, focusing initially on the pale yellows. Cheryl was very careful not to overly yellow the dye. Yellow is always more powerful than it appears in the bin. It's a stealth dominator, and it can take days and days to undo. She did all that on Saturday while I went to the fair. It was a clear, warm afternoon, and the fair offered all sorts of goodies and a delicious meat pie. Nothing looked helpful for the dress, but Manny and I laughed about the latest tapestry unicorn craze and shared a nice kiss at the end near the scrubby oaks. Everything was feeling a little more alive than usual. We held another seminar at the studio, and Cheryl did a session on warmth and seasons and how we all revolved around the sun. Central, she said. The theme of the sun is central, the center of us, core, fire. Careful with red, said the color master when I went to visit. She was thinner and weaker, but her eyes were still coals. Her brother had gotten up to try to take care of her and had thrown out his back to the worst degree and was now in the medicine arena strapped to a board. My sister is dying, he told the doctors, but he couldn't move, so all they did was shake their heads together. The color master had refused any help. I want to see death as clearly as possible, she'd said. No drugs. I made her some toast, but she only ate a few bites and then pushed it aside. It's tempting to think of red for the sun, she said, but it has to be just a dash of red, not much, more of a dark orange and a hint of brown, and then white on yellow on white. White, I said. No, really? Not bright white, she said, the kind of white that makes you squint, but in a softer way. Yeah, I said, sighing, and where does one find that kind of white? Keep looking, she said. Last time I used your hair. She smiled feebly. Go look at fire for a while. Go spend some time with fire. I don't want you to die, I said. Yes, well, she said, and? Looking at fire was interesting, I have to admit. I sat with a candle for a couple hours. It has these stages of color, the white, the yellow, the red, the tiny spot of blue I'd heard mentioned but never experienced. So I decided it made sense to use all of those in the dress, the white, the yellow, the red, a little spot of blue. We hung the dress in the center of the room, and we all revolved around it, spinning, imagining we were planets, and what did we need? It needs to be hotter, said Hans, who was playing the part of Mercury. And then he put a blowtorch to some silk and made some dust materials out of that, and we redipped the dress. Cheryl was off in the corner, cross-legged in a sunspot, her eyes closed, trying to soak it up. We need to soak it, she said, standing, so we left it in the dipping longer than usual. I walked by the bins, trying to feel that harmony feeling. What could call me or not call me? I felt a tug to the dark brown, so I brought a bit of it out and tossed it in the mix, and it was too dark, but with a little yellow-white from dried lily flowers, something started to pop a bit. Light, said Cheryl. It's also daylight. It's light. It's our only true light. Without it, we live in darkness and cold. The dress drip-dried in the middle of the room, and it was getting closer and just needed that factor of squinting, a dress so bright it couldn't quite be looked at. How to get that? Remember, the color master said. She sat up in bed. I keep forgetting, she said, but the king wants to marry his daughter. Her voice pointed to each word hard. That is not right, she said. Okay? Got it? Put anger in the dress, righteous anger. Do you hear me? I do not, I said, though I nodded. I didn't say I do not. I just thought that part. I played with the wooden knob of her bed frame. I had tried to put some anger in the sundress, but I was so consumed with trying to factor in the squint that all I really got in there was confusion. I think the confusion was what made an onlooker squint more than the brightness. Confusion does make people squint, though, so I ended up fulfilling the request accidentally. We'd sent it off in the carriage after working all night on the light factor that Cheryl had mentioned by adding bits of diamond dust to the mix. Diamonds are light inside darkness, she'd announced at 3 a.m. with a bialy in her hand, triumphant. On the whole, it was a weaker product than the moon dress, but not bad. The variance in subtlety is unnoticed by most, and our level of general artistry and craft is high, so we could get away with a lot without anyone running over and asking for his money back. The sky, the color master told me after I'd filled her in on the latest. She'd fallen back down into her pillows and was so weak she spoke with her eyes closed. When I held her hand, she only rested hers in mine, not limp, not grasping. Sky is last, she said, and death soon. She didn't move with her hand in mine, and she fell asleep midway through our conversation. I stayed all night. I slept, too, sitting up, and sometimes I woke and just sat and watched her sleeping. What a very precious person she was, really. I hadn't known her very well, but she had picked me for some reason, and that picking was changing me. I could feel it. It was like being warmed by the presence of the sun a little. The way a ray of sun can seem to choose you as you walk outside from a cold exterior, from the cold interior. I wanted to put her in that sundress, to drape her in it, but it wasn't an option. We'd sent it off to the princess, and it wasn't even the right size, and it wasn't her style either. But I guess I just knew that the sundress we sent was something of a facsimile, and this person here was the real sun, the real center for us all. And even through the dark night, I felt the light of her burning, even in the rasping breathing of a dying woman. In the morning, she woke up, saw I was still there, and smiled a little. I brought her tea. The anger, she said, as if she just remembered, which maybe she had. She raised up on her elbows, face blazing. Don't forget to put the anger in this last dress, she said, okay? Drink your tea, I said. Listen, she said, it's important. The king wants to marry his own daughter. She shook her head. It was written in pain all over her forehead. It's wrong, she said. She sat up higher on her elbows. She looked beyond me, through me, and I could feel meaning thick in her. She picked her words carefully. You cannot bring it into the world and then bring it back into you, she said. It's the wrong action. Her face was clear of emphasis, and she spoke plainly as possible, as if there were no taboo about fathers marrying daughters, as if the sex factor were not a biological risk, as if it weren't just disturbing and upsetting as a given. She held herself steady on her elbows. This was why she was the color master. There was no stigma, no judgment, no societal subscription, no trigger morality, but just a clean and pure anger, fresh, as if she were thinking the possibility over for the first time. You birth someone, she said. You birth someone and then you release her. You do not marry her, which is a bringing back in. You let her go. Put anger in the dress, she said. She gripped my hand, and suddenly all the weakness was gone, and she was right there, an electric pulse of a person. And I knew this was the last time we would talk. I knew it so clearly that everything sharpened into incredible focus. I could see the threads of the weave of her nightgown, the microscopic bright cells in the whites of her eyes. Her nails bit into my hand. I felt the tears rising up in me, the teacup wobbling on the nightstand. Got it? She said. Yes, I said. I put anger in the dress, the color of the sky. I put it in there so much I could hardly stand it. That she was about to die, that she would die unrecognized, that none of us would ever live up to her, and that we were the only witnesses. that we are all so small after all that everybody dies anyway. I put the anger in there so much that the blue of the sky was fiercely stark, an electric blue like the core of the fire, so much it was hard to look at. It was so much harder to look at than the sundress. The sky dress was of a whole different order, intensely, shockingly, bluely vivid. Let her go? This was the righteous anger she had asked for, yards of it, bolts of it, even though paradoxically it was anger I felt because soon she would be gone. She died the following morning in her sleep. Even at her funeral, all I could feel was the rage pouring out of me while we stood around her coffin crying, leaning on one another, sprinkling colors from the dye bins into her hands, the colors of heaven, we hoped, while the rest of the town went about its business. Her brother rolled in on a stretcher, weeping. I had gone over to see her that morning and found her dead in her bed, so quiet, the morning sun white and clear through the window panes. I stroked her hair down for an hour, her silver hair, before I left to tell anyone. The dress request had already come in the day before, as predicted. At the studio under deadline, Cheryl led a seminar on blue and sky and space and atmosphere and depth, and it was successful and mournful, especially during the week after the funeral. Blue. I attended, but mostly I was nurturing the feeling in me, that rage, tending to it like a little candle flame cupped against the wind. I knew it was the right kind. I knew it. I didn't think I'd do much better than this dress ever. I would go on to do good things in my life, have other meaningful moments, share in the experience of being a human being in the world, but I knew this was my big moment and I had to be equal to it. So I sat at the seminar with half a focus, just cupping that candle flame of rage, and I half participated in the dyeing of the fabric and the discussion of the various shades. And then when they had done all they could do and the dress was hanging in the middle, a clear and beautiful blue, I sent everyone home. Are you sure? Cheryl asked, buttoning up her coat. Go, I said, yes. It was night and the blue sky was unlit and it was a new moon, so it was up to me to find the blue sky in here only. It was draped over all of us, but hidden. I went to the bins and listened for the chords and I felt her in me. I felt the ghost of her passing through me as I mixed and dyed. And I felt the rage in me that she had to be a ghost, the softness of the ghost right up next to and surrounding the sharp and burning core of my anger. Both got in my hands. I picked the right colors to mix with blue, a little of so many other colors, and then so many different kinds of blue and gray and more blue and more. And in it all, the sense of shaking my fists at the sky, shaking my fists high up to the sky, because that is what we do when someone dies too early, too beautiful, too undervalued by the world, or sometimes just at all. We shake our fists at the sky, the vast sky, the big, blue, beautiful, indifferent sky, and the anger is righteous and strong and helpless and huge. I shook and I shook, and I put all of it into the dress. When the sun rose, it was a clear morning, the early sky pale and wide. I had worked all night. I wasn't tired yet, but I could feel the pricklings of it around me, peripheral. I made a pot of coffee and sat in the chill with a cup and the dress, which I had hung again from a hanger in the middle of the room. The rest of the tailors drifted over in the morning one by one, and no one said anything. They entered the room and looked up, and then they surrounded it with me, and we held hands. And they said I was the new color master, and I said okay, because it was obvious that was true, even though I knew I would never reach her levels again. But at least for this one dress, I did. They didn't even praise me. They just looked at it and cried. We all cried. Esther sent off the invoice pigeon, and with care we placed the dress into its package, and when the carriage came by, we laid it carefully over the back seat, as usual. Manny came by right before the carriage left, and he looked at an edge of fabric to see the color as we were packing it up, and he held me close. We ate our hunk of gift chocolate. We cleaned up the area around the bins and swept the floor of dust and talked to a builder, a friend of Manny's, about expanding one of the rooms into an official seminar studio. The carriage trotted off with the dress in the back seat, led by 2 white horses. From what I heard, soon after the princess got the 3rd dress, she left town. The rest I do not know. The rest of the story, known, I'm told, as donkey skin, is hers. Thanks. I would say no. And the reason I would say no, there's a couple things. For one, it's wonderful to be a writer because you can write anything never have to show anyone. Much different, I think, than being an actor where you really have to like do it on the spot, you know. That seems much more terrifying to me. There was a story I was writing about a big man torturing a little man, and I was so disturbed by that story. And I worked on it over several years because it was really a story about a kind of sadistic relationship, and it creeped me out. And I felt like I can't show this to anyone. And finally, I was reading it over, and I was like, I think this story is not bad. And I showed it to a friend who was like, this is a great story. And it was so helpful because I didn't know that. And since then, I think it's become a story, one of the stories I get the most comments from. So what I take from that is you can go to the most dangerous, dark, frightening, gross, creepy, horrific thing, because your beliefs, who you are as a person, will shape that and explore that. You can trust that. You can trust your essential interest in people or humanity or whatever, even if you're drawn to the most horrific, sick thing you can think of, the most dangerous, loaded thing. If you give yourself time to explore, it will lead you somewhere interesting. I really believe that. It's the same, too, with an offensive character. Some people are afraid of writing an offensive character. How are we supposed to understand offensive people if you don't write offensive characters? And I mean that very sincerely. How do you find the third dimension to someone who presents to you a flat screen of themselves? You have to learn about them. That's a way to learn about them. And again, you don't have to show anyone. But why not explore that? For me, what functions for me well is a very set block of time and the steadiness of writing a couple hours every morning. And I know I'm going to do it so that even if I have a very, very, very bad writing day, I know I'll be back tomorrow and then the next day and then the next day. And eventually it buckles under the pressure of routine. So I do think taking a long walk can be helpful, but for me, it's much more, the thing that works the best is just to feel like they're waves, the writing process, just they're waves of crap that you just have to kind of sit through. You have to sit through the, like, I'm a terrible writer. You have to sit through, I'm a brilliant writer. You have to sit through, I have nothing to write ever again. You have to sit through, what am I doing? I hate sitting here. You have to sit through, like, the dishes are dirty, you know, and eventually something happens. Understanding and meaning are not my goal for your first level of experience of a story. It is not my feeling is to say, like, to read that story and be like, now you can say, like, I understand that full story. What I want most is to make you feel something, and I don't care what it is that you're feeling. I want you to feel something, and then hopefully that would make you want to think about it more, and then arrive at meaning later. Yeah, writing exercises I believe in very much. In some ways, this was like a writing exercise because I had an assignment, which was to retell a fairy tale, and that charged me up. But I think my belief in writing exercises is that if you are left to your own devices and you have a blank page and you have a story due, often people go towards their conventional choice of story. That's often the first step to do is like, well, I like to write stories about a room, so I'm going to do another one of those. And if you're sitting there and someone is like, write a story and will you please use corn in the first sentence? Then suddenly you're like, okay, I guess I'm writing a story that has corn in the first sentence, and you just surprise yourself. So I really think it does something to the mind.